Trump says peace is near, then an American warship goes on the radio and tells a vessel in the Gulf to clear its engine room or prepare for disabling fire. That is the scene, not the whole war, not the whole region, just that one split screen moment, a president talking like the conflict is almost over, a Navy talking like it is about to get bigger and somewhere outside the frame. China is watching both things happen at once. That is where this story really begins. Because the real question is not whether China wants the war in Iran to end. Of course it does. The real question is whether China wants the war to end before it has done enough damage to the American-led order. That is the whole argument. China needs the fighting to stop. China also needs America to keep looking reckless, expensive, and strategically unreliable for a little longer. That is the paradox. And once you see that paradox clearly, almost everything else in this war starts to make sense. On the most basic level, China has stronger material reasons than almost anyone to want a ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz is not a faraway headline for Beijing. It is one of the exposed arteries of the Chinese economy. Before the war, nearly 5 million barrels of crude a day moved through that corridor on their way to China. That is around a quarter of China's daily oil consumption. It is not marginal supply, it is system supply, and it is not just any oil. A lot of it is discounted Iranian oil tied to a long-term strategic agreement. China signed a 25-year partnership with Iran worth hundreds of billions of dollars across infrastructure, banking, ports, transport, telecoms, and energy. In return, China got something every industrial great power wants: supply security at a favorable price. So if you stop here, the Chinese position seems obvious. End the war, reopen Hormuz, normalize shipping, get the fuel moving, stabilize the world that Chinese factories still depend on. That is true. It is also incomplete, because while the war is hurting China materially, it is helping China politically and strategically. That is the second half of the picture, and it is the part most people still do not understand. Beijing is watching the United States do something that China has wanted for years but could never force so quickly on its own. America is discrediting itself in public. Look at what the war now looks like from the outside. Trump announces peace, then threatens more force. A ceasefire seems near, then starts slipping. Negotiations are described as close, then collapse. A blockade is sold as leverage, then begins to look like escalation without a clean exit. The language coming from Washington is not the language of a calm manager of order. It is the language of a superpower that can still inflict enormous damage, but is becoming worse at converting damage into stable outcomes. That matters far beyond Iran to Europe. It raises the old question again: is the United States still a reliable strategic center, or has it become a source of volatility inside the alliance system it claims to anchor? To Asia, the message is even sharper. If Washington is willing to burn through resources, patience, and diplomatic coherence this way in the Middle East, then every American security guarantee elsewhere starts to feel less automatic and more conditional. To the Gulf, the conclusion is brutal. America still brings power, but its power now often arrives bundled with disorder, uncertainty, and the possibility that no one is fully controlling the escalation ladder. That is geopolitical gold for China, because Beijing has spent years trying to persuade the world that the American-led order is becoming unstable. Usually that takes long diplomatic work. You point to contradictions, you point to interventions, you point to sanctions, double standards, trade coercion, alliance fatigue. But right now, Washington is performing the argument for Beijing in real time. China does not even need to push very hard. It just needs to stand there and look calmer. That is the first real layer of China's endgame: be the stable counter image. Not the kinder power, not the cleaner power, just the less combustible one. The one that looks less likely to announce peace in the morning and expand the war by afternoon. That image matters because this is no longer just a military era. It is an era of confidence crisis. States are not only asking who is strongest, they are asking who is safest to depend on, and that is exactly where Beijing wants to win. Now take the next step. China does not only want America to look, it wants America to look structurally expensive. That is a deeper and more valuable outcome, because what this war is forcing Washington to spend is not only ships, missiles, aircraft, and air defense. It is also political capital, alliance trust, market confidence, domestic patience, and strategic reputation. America is spending hard assets and soft assets at the same time. And worst of all, for Washington, the meaning of each new action keeps slipping. A strike does not produce closure, a blockade does not produce submission, a negotiation does not produce trust, a ceasefire does not produce calm. Everything costs something, but nothing closes the loop. That is exactly the kind of war Beijing wants the United States to own. Not because China enjoys the violence, China hates the instability, but because every extra week of American entanglement in a conflict with unclear political objectives gives Beijing room elsewhere. Room in Asia, room in Europe, room in the Gulf, room in the global South, room to tell governments all over the world, look, the power that says it guarantees order is now manufacturing disorder faster than it can control it. That is the second layer of China's endgame. Let America pay the reputational bill for the war. Now move one layer further, because the regional economics matter here just as much as the great power image war. China's relationship with the Middle East is no longer just about buying oil. It is about building itself into the region's commercial nervous system. Chinese exports to the region have surged over the last decade. EVs, telecom systems, construction materials, industrial goods, logistics, desalination, digital infrastructure. Beijing is not trying to conquer the Gulf militarily. It is trying to become too economically embedded to be ignored. That means China does not need the region to love it. It needs the region to hedge. It needs Gulf governments to decide that depending too much on Washington now carries more risk than it used to, while keeping Beijing close carries more value than it used to. This war helps produce exactly that psychology. If America still looked like the unquestioned adult in the room, China's advance would be slower, but America does not look like that. Now it looks strong, yes, but restless, improvisational, and increasingly unable to stop crises from widening after it enters them. That is the opening Beijing sees, a region frightened enough to diversify a U.S. prestige, structure damaged enough to create openings, but still enough order left for trade, investment, ports, energy, and industrial links to keep expanding. That is the sweet spot, and here's where the paradox becomes even sharper, because China cannot let the war go too far. This is the mistake made by people who talk too casually about Beijing benefiting from every American failure. China is not insulated from systemic disorder. China rose inside the global trading system. It is the workshop of the world. It sells industrial machinery, electronics, solar panels, consumer goods, and intermediate products across the planet. That model needs energy reliability, shipping confidence, insurance, payments, and demand. If the war in Iran pushes the global order too close to seizure, China suffers badly. If Hormuz stays disrupted too long, China suffers. If global confidence collapses too far, China suffers. If trade instability starts choking the wider system, China suffers. So Beijing is trying to manage a very narrow corridor. It wants the war painful enough to weaken America. It does not want the war catastrophic enough to break the global platform. China still depends on. That is the true China paradox. It wants the fighting to stop. It also wants the Americans to keep paying the political cost of the fighting before it stops. It wants Iran to survive. It does not want to become Iran's open co-belligerent. It wants a weaker American-led order. It does not want that order to collapse before China has built enough alternatives to exploit the vacuum. That is why the speculation about Chinese military support matters so much. If Beijing is helping Iran strengthen defenses, then the logic is not that China wants Iran to win some glorious civilizational war. The logic is narrower and colder: keep Iran from breaking, keep the war from ending on clean American terms, keep Washington bleeding credibility, but do all of that from one step back with denial, ambiguity, and distance. That is classic Chinese positioning. Not open intervention, not total passivity, managed involvement, enough to shape the balance, not enough to own the battlefield. So what is the end game? Not an Iranian victory, not an American victory, not permanent war. China's best case outcome is a world that comes out of this crisis believing 5 things at once. First, the United States is still dangerous, but no longer reliably wise. Second, America can still destroy, but can no longer easily convert destruction into stable political outcomes. Third, alliances under Washington are becoming more anxious, more conditional, and more transactional. Fourth, China is not a military savior, but it is increasingly the indispensable commercial and diplomatic hedge. And fifth, the future international system will not be held together by one uncontested power, but by hedging, multipolarity, and regional actors buying security in one place and prosperity somewhere else. That is the world China wants, not because it is beautiful, because it is usable. Beijing does not need to replace America overnight. It only needs America to become less automatic, less trusted, less central, less able to close every crisis on its own terms. That may be exactly what this war is helping China do. So yes, China wants the storm to stop, but only after the storm has done enough damage to the myth that America is still indispensable grown up in the room. That is the contradiction. That is the strategy. That is the end game. China wants the war to end, but not before the war has helped rearrange the hierarchy of the world.